Okay. So, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, everybody, wherever you might be around the world on Zoom or on YouTube. My name's Melissa Leach. I'm Director of IDS, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this year's round of Sussex Development Lectures. The SDLs are our flagship series hosted by IDS, by the School of Global Studies, the Science Policy Research Unit and the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex. And our topic this year, perhaps not surprisingly, is COVID-19 and development. And the angle we've chosen is building back better with an all-important question mark. Because COVID-19 is, of course, far more than a disease crisis. We're seeing its impact being felt globally, with huge social, economic and political disruptions. It's laid bare systemic inequalities and injustices. It's raised big questions about accountability, about state-society relations. And while many of these impacts have, of course, been really devastating, and there are a lot of challenges around the recovery, I think we've also begun to see the crisis offering some glimpses of how more progressive transformations could be achieved, and ways in which we might begin to think about building solidarities across communities, across sectors, across disciplines. So what we want to ask in this series this year is this a moment for some quite fundamental transformations in development, in thinking and in practice? What do these look like and how might they be achieved? And we've got a fantastic set of lectures and debates lined up over the coming months that will pick up on different aspects of this agenda. But today's event is a special one. What we want to do is set the scene by introducing the four institutions who are co-hosting the series. And they'll give a brief flavour of some of the work and research that they're doing and its connections with COVID-19. So I'm really delighted to welcome our panel. We've got four people. I will speak first to say something about IDS. Then we'll hear from Mike Collier, Professor of Geography in the School of Global Studies, from Mario Novelli, who's the Director for the Centre of International Education, and Andy Sterling, who is Professor of Science and Technology Policy at SPRU and co-director of the STEPS Centre. So before we begin, some quick housekeeping points. I'd like to ask everybody to mute their microphones, please, when they're not speaking. I'd like to welcome Marco Nardi, who you will already be seeing doing English to British Sign Language translation, interpreting this event for us. I'd like to invite you all to tweet enthusiastically, I hope, or quizzically, using the hashtags #SussexDev and #GlobalDevTrends. I'd like to note that if you miss bits now or other people want to watch it, the lecture will be available to watch after the event via the IDS website and YouTube. And the slides that you'll see presented will be available on the IDS webpage if you want to look at those. We'll hear some presentations and then there'll be questions and comments, really welcome from the audience. And what we'd like you to do, please, is type your questions in the chat box, either in Zoom or on YouTube. And we'll then select a group of questions to address and ask the panelists to respond to those. So without further ado, let's begin by hearing from our institutions. And first, but by no means most important, I'll tell you a little bit about IDS and what we're doing in this area. So IDS research, COVID-19 and development. So the Institute of Development Studies is a global institution which happens to be based on the Sussex campus for research, for teaching and learning, and for communication aimed at equitable and sustainable change. And we're independent in our constitution, but we work in really close partnership with the University of Sussex, with many, many areas of close collaboration. We've got around 230 staff, including more than 120 researchers and knowledge professionals who have homes in 10 different thematic research clusters and also in cross-cutting projects and programs with hundreds of different partners around the world. And they bring social science expertise predominantly from a number of different disciplines: sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, participatory research, into interaction with natural scientists, health scientists, and critically with actors in communities, civil society, governments, international agencies, to try and co-construct and mobilize research evidence so that it makes a genuine difference around global development challenges, contributing both what one might call instrumental, more practical impacts, and also ones that are conceptual and often very critical. So our recently launched new strategy, if I can get this to move on, sorry, this is not moving. Oh, sorry, yeah. Our recently launched new strategy, which we've called Transforming Knowledge, Transforming Lives, helps to structure a kind of summary of some of the areas where we're working at the moment, bringing together existing and current projects and future ideas to try and respond to the many disruptions of our era. So these are the commitments that we've set ourselves to try and deliver on over this next period through existing and future work. The first is around upholding climate and environmental justice, responding to really dramatic disruptions around climate and environmental change. And this is just a selection of some of the themes and some of the centres and programmes and consortia that are working in this area. Our second big commitment is around reducing extreme inequities, recognising that poverty matters, but the gaps really matter too, multiple inequalities. And again, here are some of the themes and the big consortium programmes that are working here. Our third is around fostering healthy and fulfilling lives, recognising health as much more than a biomedical matter. This is about well-being, emotional and mental health, as well as physical health. Again, here are some of our projects and programmes. And then our fourth big commitment is around nurturing more democratic, inclusive, accountable societies, a really big challenge in current times through some of the projects you see listed here. So how are we working around COVID? We're engaged in three main ways, which do overlap somewhat. So the first is to conduct responsive research and knowledge sharing, which is directly responding to COVID-19 as a public health challenge and a wider development challenge. And we've got a number of different platforms at work here, from the Social Science and Humanitarian Action platform to the work our Knowledge for Development platform is doing through its help desk, and the work we're doing to feed into the Global Symposium on Health Systems Research. Our second, though, looks to the future and addresses quite directly this challenge about building back better or building back differently or building ahead differently. And these are some of the areas of work here, including briefings commissioned directly by Irish Aid, a new COVID collective, which is supported by the FCDO, which is conducting work in a number of areas, forward-looking, and a new programme for IDRC. And then the third is to recognise that many, if not most, of the programmes that you saw listed on my earlier slides have pivoted at least part of their work to address the wider implications of the pandemic. So this is just a brief list amongst many of them, bringing aspects of the work that was already going on to consider the implications of COVID and COVID transformations into the future. So it'd be great to talk more about these. I don't have time now, but you can read more on our website. Sorry, this link hasn't actually shown up, but the IDS website carries further information about all of these projects, and I'm very happy to address more in questions. So thanks very much for listening. And we'll now move on to our next panelist, who will be Mike Collier, if you're there, if you'd like to share your slides. So Mike will share with us some of the work that the School of Global Studies is doing.
Thanks very much indeed, Melissa, I'm just going to share. I've just got one slide to go over the points I wanted to make. The School of Global Studies comprises 4 departments in the university: international development, geography, international relations, and anthropology, and includes 8 school research centres and a significant contribution to a number of university level research centres that link into other schools. We've, over the last 5 or 6 months, produced a huge range of publications and new projects around COVID, which are linked on the first web link at the top there, that provides some details of the sort of projects and publications that people are involved in. There's 110 full-time faculty across those 4 departments, many of them engaged in these projects. So you can imagine that it's a substantial list that I won't go into in great detail now. But I wanted to pull out a few headlines that link to work which is currently going on and help to point us to this idea of building back better or differently, or building ahead is a term that I quite like. Firstly, the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme is a university level institution that also includes IDS. But there's a significant number of members of the School of Global Studies who contribute to it. And they've produced a very interesting series of publications around COVID and the challenges that COVID brings up. That's been put together by Andreas Antoniadis, who's going to be speaking in this series early next year, I think. But climate and environment are one of the key themes of SSRP through the Climate at Sussex programme. And linking into some of the points that Melissa made, I think the opportunities for developing a lower carbon economy and building on some of the changes that we've seen, some of the possibilities that dramatic change can clearly have impacts on the sort of fundamentals of the carbon economy. So this is one of the possible areas that I think any alternative set of futures have to start considering. Health is another key area of research. There are 2 centres in global studies that work directly on health. Firstly, the Centre on Cultures of Reproduction, Technologies and Health has engaged nationally and internationally on responses to COVID to ensure a more equal set of responses, which I think is one of the key goals of any sort of response. And the Centre for Global Health Policy, led by Stefan Elber, has produced a range of more international relations-based issues that are concerned with things like distribution of vaccines when they become available, and the politics of the international relations behind the distribution of vaccines. You'll hear from Anne Romamala, who's a researcher in that centre later in this series as well. Thirdly, the Sussex Centre for Migration Research is another large interdisciplinary centre that goes beyond global studies, but is directed from within global studies. And the extent of mobility restrictions that we've seen both nationally and internationally over the last few months have had a very significant impact on the use of migration as an alternative, as an opportunity to get out of poverty. Priya Dashankar is speaking later in this series, and was the research director of the DFID-funded Migrating Out of Poverty Centre. That really highlighted the impact of mobility controls on the opportunities that migration presents people, particularly people living in extreme poverty, to offer some alternatives to get out of poverty. One of the difficulties that SCMR research has highlighted over the last few months is the fact that this is a crisis which has hit everywhere in the world equally, means that the sort of insurance that some people were able to link to has not been able to support the sort of alternatives through migrant remittances, for example. And finally, a very interesting series of articles co-edited by Gominda Bambra, who's in the IR department, on the Discover Society website. I think is worth highlighting. With some very interesting theoretical approaches that Gominda and colleagues are producing there. So a range of ongoing and very much future-orientated projects from global studies, many of which we will hear in more detail about during the course of this this series of seminars. So I'll pass on to the next speaker. Thank you very much indeed.
Mike, that's wonderful. So I'll turn now to Mario to tell us about what CIE is doing and in this area. Excellent.
Okay, sorry about that. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, no, that's great. Perfect.
Thank you very much. So thanks a lot, Mike, Melissa, for excellent introductions. I'm pleased to represent the Centre for International Education this evening, and you know, not dissimilarly from the other speakers, I want to give a little bit of background to the work of the Centre for International Education. Reflect a little bit on COVID-19 and its relationship to education and relationship to some of our work, and then talk about a few of the events that are coming up for us in the coming months. So the Centre for International Education is a world-leading research centre exploring the relationship between education in the global south. And we're part of this broader international development studies cluster at the University of Sussex. We were founded in 1989 to really focus on those relationships between education and international development. And over those years, over 170 doctoral students have graduated from the centre. Over 500 master's students have passed through the Masters in International Education and Development. And we also run a range of programs on education and development for undergraduates. And as many of us, apart from the teaching and the mentoring, we also work on a range of research, often in collaboration with international organizations, United Nations, global trade unions, national governments, on issues related to international development and education. Like all of us, the COVID crisis has affected both our research and also our lives. And during the lockdown period, we took some time to meet as a research team and to really reflect on some of the implications of COVID-19, both for education and international development, but also for research and the work that we do. The slide that I'm showing, that hopefully we can share all our PowerPoints with all the attendees afterwards, is a position paper that we drew up collectively to reflect on some of those implications. And I think that I can't do justice to the whole of the paper, but I just wanted to raise a few issues I think that are important. I think that what the pandemic has done has brought home to the global north what many people in the global south have felt for many years and for many decades. They have experienced the disruption of their education systems. Wars, pandemics, austerity have undermined educational life chances of millions of people. And I think the COVID crisis brought home, I think, to the global north, really what it means to have your education taken away. At one point, I think there was 1.2 billion students under lockdown with schools closed around the world. And I think that, like many other things, and I think that, you know, both the presenters have talked to that in the sense that COVID-19 has the capacity to highlight some of those inequalities that we already knew existed. And I think within the education system, the pandemic has really revealed the inequalities within education. I think we saw that very clearly in the UK. Those who could go online, those who had access to technology, both institutions, but also individuals, and those who couldn't. Those who kept up and those who left behind. And I think there are long-term consequences of those processes. And I think it's revealed for us a lot of issues around private education versus public education, rich and poor, issues around gender, race, disability. They've all intersected in producing unequal short-term experiences with long-term implications for educational life chances around the world, educational infrastructures, teachers and students' lives. And I think it's those issues that we've worked on for many years in the Global South that really have relevance for the Global North in the recent period. As a result of that discussion, we've also put on a 10-week lecture series that starts next Thursday, lunchtime, 1 to 2:15, which really tries to focus on the political economy of education in times of conflict, crisis and pandemics, where we've brought speakers from around the world together. And I've put the link there. We already have about 300 people signed up for the lecture series, and we welcome more, and we'll be live streaming that. But it's an international online global lecture series, which tries to reflect on some of these contradictory ways that education has been affected by war, pandemics, crisis in different parts of the world. Our own contribution to the Sussex Development Lecture series is a conversation between Fazl Rizvi, Emeritus Professor at the University of Melbourne, Australia, who's worked for a long time on global education policy in the Global South, and our own Professor Yusuf Saeed, who, apart from being a professor in international education and development with us at Sussex, has also been in and out of the policy world, worked for DFID, has had a long association with UNESCO, and is currently working and advising for Education International on their responses, the Global Education Trade Union, on their responses to the COVID crisis and how it's impacted teachers. And I think that, you know, just as a final kind of reflection, I think of the, clearly these kind of pandemics create a moment of opportunity for a range of different social forces to transform things. And I think the concept of building better reflects that. But of course, we recognize that things can go in many different directions. There are a range of different interests trying to build back in better in terms of their own interpretation of that phrase. So I just wanted to finish with a quote from Arundhati Roy, who writes much better than myself, where she talks and reflects on this issue of returning to normality. And she says, "Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." And I hope that our lecture series can reflect both the challenges, but also the possibilities of those beautiful words. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Marco, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing those beautiful words with us. Let's keep those in mind as we move forward. Now to hear from Andy Sterling about SPRU's perspectives in this area. And just to note, please would encourage people to put their questions and comments in the Q&A boxes, either on Zoom or on YouTube. And we will have time, we should have a good half an hour to address those when we've heard from Andy. So Andy, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Melissa, for that great introduction, and thanks, Marco, for the hard act to follow there with those words still reverberating in my head. So my name's Andy Sterling. I'm from one of the sister institutes helping to convene this series called SPRU, Science Policy Research Unit. It's also a rare tropical disease, unfortunately for us, but I'm not sure that was known at the time it was named. Back in 1967, SPRU is in many ways a kind of sister institute to the Institute of Development Studies, but looking inside the university at issues of politics and policies around science, technology, and innovation in general. Obviously, all these are core themes over many decades to contested notions of development. SPRU waxes and wanes with external funding over the year. We're now actually bigger than we've ever been before. I think we're about half the size of IDS, and we have people coming from backgrounds and working on topics including economics, politics, science and technology studies, development studies, engineering, humanities, many of the natural sciences. So it's quite radically interdisciplinary, and also, which makes it sometimes a little lively place, quite politically plural as well. And way back, although we work in the global north and global south with a whole range of different partners, as do our colleagues who've just spoken, we've worked on issues in the past more narrowly called development. Since the beginning, there was a thing called the Sussex Manifesto back in 1970, which was an initiative for the United Nations that SPRU took, and the STEP Centre more recently followed it up. And we work very closely with colleagues in these international networks on that. And most recently, we co-host, as Melissa mentioned, with IDS, the STEP Centre, the Centre for Social, Technological and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability, which looks at many issues central to the debates around this current COVID crisis. And so just in quickly summarizing the kind of work, give a flavor of the kinds of things, as colleagues have done, going on in SPRU that relate to the theme of this lecture series. I guess I'll break it down into three main types of work. One is around science advice. What are the dynamics around the giving of science advice to government, the politics of that, how power works in shaping science advice. So it's not just speaking truth to power, it's also a dilemma that power shapes truth. We also look at innovation policy and politics. So obviously there are a whole range of innovation strategies come to the fore around the pandemic in different parts of the world. But innovation here, it's crucial, as already has been said, is not just about technology. It's about institutions and practices in the wider sense. Indeed, it's about culture in the wider sense. And then the third area of work rumbling away in SPRU is on transformation. And that highly vogue word at the moment means different things, as it does also in SPRU. But with some of the debates around the COVID implications for transforming the world are being contributed to from SPRU. So just to slightly ground that, in case anyone wants more detail, I've, in my somewhat uninspiring slide, each line is a link. So if you look on the slide version that will be on the website, you can link to more than I'll just give a flavor of it here. On the advice side, we've got work with the World Health Organization, looking at lessons from past pandemics and the pros and cons of science advice in that context, looking at data governance, some of the big issues from wider debates about data governance, on implications for the governance of testing apps, advising other UN agencies on post-pandemic structural changes in different regional settings, and some work published in Nature recently, a manifesto for modeling, because one of the things that's really come to the fore is that conventional modeling practices are deeply problematic, and there's some questions that should be asked, which are highlighted in that work, also collaborated in by SPRU. On the innovation side, there's work going on some of the main strands much discussed at the moment. For instance, around vaccines, we're already doing work on serendipity. And although innovation is often presented in these highly controlled stories from the cockpit, actually the reality of innovation is much more about serendipity and happenstance. So we're looking at the vaccines in that context, and both political sides in that. We're doing work on, in particular, on diagnostic testing, somewhat Cinderella option in pharmaceuticals generally, but now coming to the fore, and also looking at, based on past work, looking at different disease and food safety crises, looking at some of the ways in which powerful interests come to the fore in the giving of science advice to skew it one way or another. And that's been really focused on in some of the work, especially actually relating to the UK in relation to Brexit. And then on the final area of work that may relate to this in SPRU is on transformation. There's a consortium with government bodies all around the world, particularly in Global South, looking at the transformative innovation policy and what that could mean. That was happening anyway, but that's now undertaken a major swing of activity to how these rhetorics, and I don't want to be unfair there, but of transformative innovation relate to the COVID pandemic and how we can bend those debates in ways that are more favorable towards social justice and equality. We've got work going on for the United Nations Development Programme, which was already happening, inspired by the work of the STEP Centre, called the Strings Project, about steering innovation, because innovation isn't something that happens and goes in whatever direction the particular sector is set for it. It's something that actually follows directions governed by powerful interests in society. And now is an opportunity to, like none before, to harness those types of dynamics that SPRU has tried to look at, and the STEP Centre more recently in detail. So mentioning the STEP Centre, which I introduced at the beginning, we've just produced a book this year on the politics of uncertainty. It wasn't intended that it come out at such an auspicious time, but some of the issues, I flag it up in these links around the current mayhem that's around the pandemic, and the ways in which uncertainties are suppressed, and there's a controlling discourse pretending that things are much more sure than they are, coming from all sides in these political debates. The book explores those issues, looking at a whole range of different sectors. And the STEP Centre itself has done a very wide range of work over the years addressing challenges of pandemics, which is linked to on the slide I give in a convenient one place that you can see. We're going to hear from, I'll give a talk later in the series on this work on the politics of uncertainty and transformation, and my colleague Saurabh Arora will give a talk later on next term on the implications for debates about decolonizing development and some of the implications of coloniality for the background to the pandemic and the way in which it may play out in future, very much bearing in mind this phrase we've, I think, agreed on, that it's about building back, building ahead, not back, and building ahead differently as well as better. And then finally, a final thing that may be of interest to colleagues is that SPRU researchers have been active with other colleagues across the campus of Sussex in pioneering an initiative about, towards the post-pandemic university, because all around the world, universities have been hit especially hard by some of the pre-existing pressures and tensions from, not least the way we're talking to each other now, from the pandemic. And there are implications there for some of the pre-existing challenges in universities, and I give a link to that work as well. So I hope that's given you a flavour, somewhat a staccato flavour of some of the work underway in SPRU. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Andy, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. So if we could get the whole panel back on the screen, we've now got some time to turn to some of the questions that you've all been posting. And I think in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is read out a selection of the kind of top questions that have emerged, and then I'll turn to the panel and ask you perhaps each to respond to one or two. I mean, we won't have time for everybody to respond to everything, but pick out a couple of questions that you'd like to react to. So those that I think we might address, and there's some really good questions coming up. So first, there's a question from Lydia Cabral, asking, how does the panel see the near future of engaged development research, which we've all been talking about, in a context of restricted mobility? And in what ways can we maintain a humane connection to the field, as it were, to the real field, not just the physical field as well as the virtual field? So that's the first one. The next question is from Priyantina Bevasari, who asks, now that the COVID-19 is affecting the global north so much, will all the schools and institutions presenting here change the focus of their work to the global north, acknowledging that global north countries aren't immune from the social and economic problems that development is trying to solve? I think a very good question there. Then there's a question from Simon Stone, who asks, how can those in the development field ensure future support including COVID or indeed wider health and education related, that is based on empowered individuals and groups by giving space and listening to the genuine voices of the dispossessed, not by just applying solutions based on a perception of white privilege liberal values. So that's from Simon. And then there's actually quite a similar related question that comes from Matthew Moores, who asked, how do you think we can best as researchers hear the voices of the people disproportionately impacted by COVID-19? For example, older people and BAME communities. Particularly, and this relates back to that first question, as there's an embargo, particularly on there's difficulties in conducting face-to-face research at the moment. And he particularly looks at the bar from the university on students conducting face-to-face research. Then just a couple more. Michael Crompton asks a more specific question about what the panelists think oil and other fossil fuel price changes over the course of the pandemic, how they're panning out, and how will they affect efforts to switch to renewables and low carbon development more generally. It's a specific one about low carbon. Then a question from Sana Isa, asking please to expand on the concept of transformative innovation in terms of policy or otherwise. And then finally, and I think it'd probably better be the last we look at, Omotuyole Ambali asks for more insight in specific work going on in agricultural development, again in both global south and north. So some general ones and some specific ones. So I'll turn back to the panel. You'll recognize some of them as being more directed to particular ones of you, whereas there are others that I think several of us might respond to. So why don't we go in the same order? I'll perhaps turn back, but I'll go last in this case. So I'll turn perhaps to Mike first to pick out any of those you'd like to respond to.
Thanks, Melissa. That means I get first choice.
You do.
I will try and say something about the first two from Lydia Cabral and Valentina Benbasari. They're all extremely interesting, but those particularly grabbed me because they are issues that I've been thinking about and discussing with colleagues directly. The first, I think, given the context of mobility restrictions that we have and the need to continue doing grassroots work in places of the world that are difficult to get to for us in the global north, the only way of continuing this is through partnerships. Thankfully, most of us typically work in this way anyway, but this does raise interesting and sometimes quite difficult questions about the symmetric or asymmetric nature of those partnerships. And we always strive for equality within those partnerships and genuine participatory connections, but that's not always difficult. That's not always easy. And recently, I think we've seen some of the difficulties of that put to the forefront, where a lot of the work that we're depending on is conducted by people elsewhere in the world. That links to the second question quite nicely, I think, because one of the responses to that is, of course, for those of us working in development, to work in areas where we can do work ourselves. I think that is a tension in development that has become obvious over the last, probably decade, certainly. And one of the suggestions that we start to think about sustainability, which has a more sort of global, all-encompassing term. Within global studies, we do try to emphasize those sorts of connections between the sorts of approaches and politics and policies that many of us are focusing on outside of the UK, outside of Western Europe and North America, and the sorts of issues of equality and diversity that we're also faced with in a UK and even a very local Brighton context. One of the focuses of our recent work has been to start to develop connections very locally indeed, partly as a response to the sort of mobility restrictions that we're faced with, but also as an ideological shift to try to develop these kind of links. So I think those are both really important ideas that push us to think in interesting new directions. I'll leave it there. But
yeah, brilliant, Mike. Thank you very much. So Mario, any points that you'd like to pick up there?
I mean, I'll try to be additive in the sense that I kind of feel more comfortable as well with the first few questions, more related to my work. And, you know, I mean, I share the sentiment of Mike's argument around, well, what are the implications of, you know, the kind of research that we do? Some of us that, you know, traveled a lot and spent lots of time moving around to suddenly be faced with a regular kind of process of just coming to work in Sussex every single day and no longer traveling. And what's the implications for our research on that? And I think that, you know, there's both positives and negatives. I do believe that, you know, there is a kind of poor culture of sending the Western researcher to different parts of the world, flying in, flying out with solutions in a briefcase, both consultancy and research, that we could really do without. And I think that, you know, maybe these travel restrictions start to make the international development community aware of the need to really build research capacity in the global south and really work with partners in serious relationships. And I've just started a GCRF peer network on political economy of education. We're working with young researchers in Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa on critical political economy analysis of education systems. And I think that kind of thing is the kind of thing that at least I feel is a way forward. But there are, of course, dangers of this idea that we stay at home and we get other people to do research. This happened a decade ago after the invasion of Iraq, when there was an increasing attack on aid workers in Afghanistan, and the international community started to call what they call remote development management, where they said Western researchers were at risk, therefore we'll get local researchers or local practitioners. And then suddenly the deaths of local researchers shot up. And I think there is a danger of these unequal relationships producing more problems in terms of those areas. On the issue of, or the question of a kind of switch to a global north focus, I do think this is an opportunity to learn from the South. I think there is an awful lot of experience of coping with crisis in the global South that we could well do to listen to. And I think that, you know, there's the whole issue around schooling. I do think it's come as such a shock in the global north to have education disrupted. And it would be really interesting, instead of kind of coming up with our own solutions, actually to listen to Southern experience of that, which is often a day-to-day. And then just the final question I'd like to respond to about listening to organizations and grassroots movements and trying to, rather than thinking that we have the solutions. And I just wanted to share in the chat a website for a project that I've been engaged in over the last few years, which the website is Knowledge for Struggle, which has been about working with radical social movements in Colombia, South Africa, Nepal, and Turkey, and engaged in a process of co-production of knowledge, of trying to understand how movements learn, how they develop strategy. And I can honestly say that that has been a very interesting experience of learning from the global South and trying to bring those in to Northern debates. So I do think there are a lot of opportunities in this period, but no doubt there are many changes, and our work environments and our research is rapidly being transformed as we speak.
Yeah. Mario, thank you. So I'll turn to Andy. I think there are a couple of quite obvious ones there that would fall in your patch, if you're happy to address those.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I will have a quick go, Melissa. Although the questions are really rich and it's impossible to do full justice to them, and colleagues have said some very good things already, which I won't belabor. But with respect, just quickly to begin with, on this issue about not just the appropriateness of attention north or south, but the categories themselves. I think the question is very well posed, and these issues are being discussed very vigorously, I think, in all our home institutes, and in particular about whether development itself is not a problematic framing, a long-standing debate on that. So, I mean, SPRU, for what it's worth, has always addressed the politics that I emphasize of science and technology in the North and South, without that divide being a dominant division. We work in both settings, but there are, of course, far more diverse settings than that. And always these issues around power in science, power in knowledge, power in technology and innovation, they play out in remarkably similar ways in what has to be respected, a very diverse setting. So we do try to wrestle with that without this north-south divide category being a dominant one. Although, of course, the dominant structures pushing science and technology as they do are divided by north-south. So yes, we're interrogating these concepts of development, and I think we'll hear some of that in some of the talks. And also on this giving a voice related to that, I mean, for me as somebody individually, as a massively privileged, overprivileged in racial terms, gender terms, and class terms, for me, it can't be just about, it can't be about giving a voice. It has to be, of course, about challenging those forces that are suppressing voices and trying to use privilege, pivot privilege in that way. So challenging some of these global concentrations of power. That's what my own work in particular tries pretty unsuccessfully to do. On transformative innovation, it's a great question. What is it? Well, we don't know. It's highly contested. In fact, to be honest with you, even in SPRU, there are very strong disagreements, not just disciplinary, but also political, about what it is. Is it innovation on steroids, running faster and better than before? Or is it transformative in its political, economic, and hegemonic aims, and bringing in notions of coloniality at the deepest levels? Because speaking personally and for work at the STEP Centre, if transformation is to deliver on that name, that word, then it has to address the deeper structures in discourse, in society, around the world. And that's addressing issues, for instance, of coloniality, which Saurabh Arora, my colleague, will be talking about later in this series. And a theme from that is that in the long run, the only way to affect transformation, although the word innovation is used with it, the innovations concerned are not technological. They are cultural at the deepest of levels. And that's where social movements, collective action, cultural change become the most important drivers, not the policy cockpits. I've missed out the very specific issue on energy. Did you want me to quickly say something to that, Melissa, or shall I?
Very quick, you could say, that would be great.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, I like with a lot of these specific areas, it's an important issue, but I do honestly think, working in the area, but not putting myself forward as too big an expert, but it's all to play for. There are scenarios under which the COVID crisis could contribute towards moves that are much needed towards decarbonisation, but there are also signs already that a retrenching has taken place, which could end up resisting that. And I think it's there are real opportunities being amplified, but the dangers have also been amplified, and we just need to retrench our efforts, which SPRU is trying to do in the form of the Sussex Energy Group as a very focal activity.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I'll just pick up on a couple of these. I mean, first of all, everybody in different ways has addressed this global north-south question. I think for us at IDS and for me, the biggest opportunity that this horrible crisis offers is actually for a quite fundamental rethinking of development, really bringing to center stage some of the big challenges that we've all been trying to push over recent years, including quite fundamentally the idea that development is something that only happens in so-called developing countries, and these divides between North and South, developed and developing. If COVID could finally once and for all put a great big nail in the coffin of those divides, I think that would be incredibly valuable. And certainly that IDS strategy that I showed at the beginning and the previous work over recent years has already tried to see development as universal. It's positive change, however you debate that, however you define it, for everybody everywhere, whether they live in Brighton or Bogota or Brazil or Bamako. But yet, as we know, institutions, power relations constantly revert back to some of these really problematic divides. I think this links, though, to the other sort of group of questions about how the perspectives of the most marginalized come to have a voice in the COVID crisis and discussions around building forward differently and in development more generally. I think there's a lot of learning that's already happening, a lot of innovations and filling gaps that's happened at the grassroots from communities of all kinds, including some of the most marginalized. And we badly need to not just give those voice as if they could be given voice, but actually make sure that they have voice and are projected into ways that begin to challenge the power relations, both in how post-COVID transformations are thought about, but actually into development more generally. And I think that's a huge opportunity. Finally, just quickly, there was a specific question about agriculture. Yes, there's a lot going on, and I would particularly direct you to the work of the APRA consortium. So again, there's a link on the IDS website, which is doing some specific research on how people's agricultural livelihoods have changed around COVID-19 in a number of African countries, and what that implies for policy into the future and for policy research. And I think that individual put a follow-up question about food in the chat box. And actually the implications of COVID and post-COVID transformations for food systems, and what COVID has revealed about the unsustainability, the waste and the inequities in food is going to be the topic of one of the later Sussex Development Lectures in this series. So very, very critical and important issue. So really good questions, and I think there will all be things that are touched upon by later lectures in the series. So I'm now going to go round just once more to our panel and ask you each to share, in a way, a hope. I mean, either perhaps a response to what you've heard from the other panelists, but in particular, a hope or a challenge for the rest of the series. If there's something you'd really like us to get to grips with in the contributions that come, could you just share in a minute what that would be? So perhaps we'll go in reverse order this time. So I'll go to Andy first. Hope or a challenge for the rest of the series? You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. There's no shortage of tropes in this field, and often it's precisely when issues are most genuinely important that actually we're most prone to slipping into rhetorics. For the best of reasons, it's understandable, but I hope we can resist that. I hope we can get under the skin of notions like transformation, of not just looking at this awful crisis as a pivot for whatever it was we were going to say before in the first place. Yeah. Because that's not really doing justice to the misery and seriousness of what's actually occurring and what it's building on top of. So yeah, I hope we can just get below the and beyond the tropes.
Yeah, excellent. Mario.
Well, I don't know whether this is a hope, but I certainly think that one of the areas that we haven't explored, and I hope that we can address, is the relationship between the COVID situation and the rising authoritarianism around the world, and the kind of contradictions of that. Because I feel like, on the one hand, we are ceding powers to governments for good reasons during this pandemic, but there is also this fear that we're in a period of history where far-right, fascist, authoritarian governments are in power around the world. And you know, there is a danger of an epical kind of transformation of concepts of democracy and freedom that are manifesting from that. So I hope that in the different lectures, we maybe have a chance to reflect a little bit on the kind of pros and cons of governance issues in the present era. Okay,
excellent. I think we definitely will have, actually, and the very next one will help us do that. Mike, what would be your hope? What would you like us to address?
I'd certainly agree with what Andy and Mario both said, but I think one of the challenges of this work that is, you know, it pre-exists the crisis, certainly, but is to connect grounded concerns that relate to particular places with a global vision, and I think we've certainly seen that the various multilateral global systems have been, you know, challenged and under threat as they haven't been in the last certainly 40 or 50 years. yet any sort of response requires a global way of thinking, whether that's through migration, which is one of my own focuses, or the distribution of vaccines, a broad range of connections that require a global approach. And I think linking those up, linking the grounded expertise that these lectures present with a global vision will be a real mark of success.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I agree with all of that, and to throw in my own, I would really like this series to explore what moving forward differently looks like, both from above and from below. So we begin to really bring in those diverse perspectives, and actually to interrogate power properly around, going back to that wonderful quote from Arundhati Roy that Mario shared with us, and that solicited lots of enthused and excited comments in the chat. Of course, that gives us a vision of a pandemic portal to a transformed future in a positive sense. We, of course, have the counter possibility, which would be Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, and the reflections that came out now around the financial crisis in 2008-2010, when that book was written, which suggests that actually crises are an opportunity for those in power to shore up their power and authority, and actually to reinforce problematic status quos. So are we, in fact, is this pandemic portal, how is it going to play out? Are we going to see the opportunities for some hope, for building forward differently, building back better? Or are we going to see a reshoring of power relations? And I think that's a broad theme which may come up in a number of different sessions and lectures and topics that we are going to consider over the next period. But they do require an interrogation of power in all its guises and disguises, something that I think in different ways all of our schools are good at doing. It's part of our stock in trade, and I hope we'll have some really good debates about power and transformation as we go. So we will be starting that further exploration very shortly, the week after next, as ever is, at the next Sussex Development Lecture, which will be on the 12th of October, on governance and trust. So launching straight into some of these questions of authority, authoritarianism, and power. And that'll be given by Shandana Momand in conversation with Ali Chima from LUMS in Pakistan. And we've taken deliberately a conversational debating format for all of these lectures, but recognizing that they're dealing with contentious issues where we really need to bring diverse perspectives to the fore and have proper debates. So please join us on October the 12th. And thank you very much to all of you today. Please tweet, please re-listen, please follow up the links, and look forward to seeing you all next time. So thank you all. Bye.